Someone might see. One rancher's choice turned the town upside down. Ethan Carter woke up long before the sun had even thought about rising. The first soft light of dawn barely touched the wide fields surrounding his ranch, but the sounds of morning already filled the air. The low murmur of the river running nearby, the occasional crow of a rooster, and the distant neigh of horses from the neighboring farms reminded him that life here followed its own quiet rhythm. Ethan was used to this routine, to the solitude, and to the steady work that ranch life demanded. It was a life that required patience, strength, and a respect for the land, and Ethan had all three in abundance. Every morning he walked through the barn first, checking on his livestock. The cows were calm and slow-moving, their soft lowing filling the air as he moved between them. He had raised these animals with care, feeding them on schedule, cleaning their pens, and treating any signs of illness immediately. Ethan believed that animals responded to kindness and consistency, and in return, they gave him steady work and a sense of accomplishment. There was pride in watching the herd grow strong and healthy under his attention, and pride in knowing that no corners were ever cut in his care. After checking the livestock, Ethan made his way to the fences. The wooden posts were old but sturdy, and the rails had been repaired more times than he could count. He walked along the lines, hammer in hand, inspecting each connection, tightening any loose nails. To an outsider, it might have seemed tedious, almost endless work, but Ethan found comfort in it. There was a rhythm to the labor, a meditation in the repetition. Each repaired fence meant his animals were safe, and each sound of the hammer against wood felt like progress made in the quiet, patient world he had built around himself. The town itself was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Most mornings, as Ethan made his way into town to pick up supplies or deliver products to the local market, he was greeted with familiar faces and polite nods. He exchanged a few words here and there, mostly about the weather or how the crops were doing. Conversation rarely went deeper, and that suited him just fine. He had always valued privacy and self-reliance, and he knew that in a town this small, a man's reputation could change on a single misstep or a careless word. Despite his solitary tendencies, Ethan was respected. People admired his dedication and work ethic, though they didn't always understand the quiet intensity with which he approached life. Some called him stubborn, others called him practical, and he didn't mind either label. He had learned long ago that in a community like this, appearances mattered, but integrity mattered more. He preferred to act carefully, to think before speaking, and to avoid unnecessary drama. His life was simple, yes, but it was rich in its own way, filled with the satisfaction of work done well and a land tended faithfully. One morning, as he made his usual rounds near the boundary of his property, he noticed something unusual. The river, normally clear and sparkling under the early sunlight, carried a strange, murky color. He frowned, leaning down to inspect the water. It smelled faintly of chemicals, not the fresh, earthy scent he had come to associate with this part of the ranch. His heart tightened with concern. The river was more than just a landmark. It was a source of water for his animals, a natural part of the land that had sustained life here for decades. If it were poisoned or contaminated, it could spell disaster not just for his livestock, but for the surrounding farms and even the local wildlife. Ethan's mind raced as he followed the river upstream. There, near the edge of the neighboring land, he saw it. Large containers, partially hidden behind bushes, spilled waste into the water. He recognized the substance immediately. It was industrial waste, likely dumped illegally. His jaw tightened as anger mixed with concern. This wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. Someone had chosen to put convenience above safety, and the consequences could be severe. He stood there for a long moment, weighing his options. He knew the man who owned the neighboring land, a gruff, proud man who took offense easily and valued his privacy almost as much as Ethan did. Reporting this could lead to serious conflict. The town was small, and people were loyal to each other in ways that could make justice complicated. On the other hand, doing nothing meant risking his own animals and the environment he cared so deeply about. Ethan walked back slowly, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He replayed the scene in his mind, thinking through the consequences of each potential choice. If he confronted the neighbor directly, the man might react angrily, possibly even taking offense in a way that could escalate into something dangerous. If he went to the authorities openly, the town would know, and his reputation could be challenged. And yet, if he ignored the situation, the river would continue to be polluted, and the harm would spread. It was a dilemma that tugged at his sense of responsibility, his pride, and his need for peace. Back at the ranch, Ethan tried to return to his routine. He fed the animals, repaired the fence by the barn, and even managed a brief smile at the sight of a calf taking its first hesitant steps. But his mind kept drifting back to the river. He remembered long summer evenings spent sitting on the riverbank, the gentle rush of water soothing and familiar. That same water was now carrying poison, and he couldn't ignore it. Throughout the day, he noticed other signs of small disruptions. The smell lingering near the barn, the occasional sick bird near the river, and the uneasy stirrings of his cattle when they approached the water. All of it added weight to his conscience. For the first time in weeks, he couldn't simply focus on the rhythm of work. The responsibility he felt toward his land and animals pressed down on him, a reminder that choices had consequences, and sometimes silence could be more dangerous than action. As evening approached, the sun casting long golden shadows across the fields, Ethan sat on the porch of his modest home, staring at the horizon. He thought about the people in the town, about the careful balance that kept life moving quietly and predictably. He thought about the neighbor, about the risk of confrontation, and about what it truly meant to do the right thing. In that stillness, he realized that the decision wasn't about fear or pride, it was about responsibility. Someone had to act. Someone had to protect the land, the animals, and the future. He didn't speak to anyone that evening, not even his closest friends. Privacy was a shield he had always relied on, and now it was a necessity. His thoughts circled endlessly. What if someone saw him taking action? What if the town turned against him for meddling? What if the consequences of speaking out were more harmful than the silence he dreaded? And yet, he knew that doing nothing was a path he could not take. The land, the animals, and the quiet life he cherished were worth the risk. Night settled over the ranch, and the stars began to peek through the darkening sky. Ethan remained on the porch, watching the moonlight dance across the fields. His hands rested on his knees, calloused and strong, shaped by years of labor and care. There was a deep weariness in him, not from physical work, but from the weight of choices yet to be made. He whispered to himself, almost reflexively, the words that had lingered in his mind since the river incident. Someone might see, someone always does. Even in solitude, he felt the presence of the town, the invisible web of eyes that seemed to follow every action. Ethan had always respected the subtle social rules, the unspoken contracts that held the community together. He knew that stepping out of line could bring suspicion, and yet he also knew that courage often required stepping forward when it was hardest to do so. Sleep came fitfully that night. He dreamed of the river, of the animals, and of a small town teetering between curiosity and judgment. The choice he faced was not easy, and he could feel the weight of it pressing even in rest. He woke with the first light of dawn once again, his mind set in a way it hadn't been before. There would be action, careful and deliberate, but action nonetheless. He could no longer ignore the warning signs. The quiet life he valued was about to be disrupted, and the ripples of one choice would stretch far beyond his own ranch. Morning arrived with the familiar sounds of roosters and rustling leaves. Ethan dressed quickly, grabbing his hat and boots. Today, he would take the first steps toward resolving the problem, even if the town remained unaware. He moved with a quiet determination, aware that the balance of right and wrong rested in his hands. For the first time in years, the rhythm of the ranch was not enough to soothe him entirely. There was a tension in the air, a story beginning that would not stay confined to the fields and fences he had known so well. And so the day began, not with simple work, but with a sense of purpose heavier than any fence post or feed sack. Ethan Carter, a man who had lived quietly for so long, now stood at the edge of a decision that could turn the town upside down. The choice was his, the consequences unknown, and the truth waiting to ripple through every corner of the small community. Ethan Carter spent the next morning thinking carefully about what he would do. The previous day's discovery weighed heavily on him, but he knew the situation could not be ignored. The river was vital, not just to his ranch, but to the surrounding land, the livestock, and even the people in the town who depended on clean water for their own animals and gardens. He had always acted responsibly, and this time, responsibility demanded courage. He dressed quickly, putting on his worn boots and a simple flannel shirt. The sun had barely risen, casting soft golden light across the fields, and the air smelled of fresh earth and hay. Ethan walked toward the river, taking a slow, deliberate path that kept him hidden from the neighboring land. He did not want to be seen until he knew what steps to take. For years, he had valued privacy, and though this situation was different, some habits were hard to change. Arriving at the riverbank, he carefully examined the containers that were dumping waste into the water. He took photographs with his old camera, documenting the damage without leaving a trace that would reveal his presence. Every detail mattered. The way the liquid mixed with the river, the smell, the discoloration of the water, and even the distressed wildlife that moved away from the contaminated area. Ethan knew that solid evidence would be necessary if he reported this to the authorities. Once he had documented everything, he packed the camera away and walked slowly back to his ranch, his mind already planning his next move. He could not confront the neighbor directly. It would likely lead to anger and conflict, and in a town this small, conflicts had a way of becoming personal and lasting. Instead, he decided to report it anonymously. He would send the evidence to the local environmental agency, keeping his name out of it. That way, the law could act, and he could maintain his distance from the gossip and drama that might follow. By late morning, Ethan had prepared a careful letter. He described what he had seen, including dates, times, and the types of waste being dumped. He attached the photographs, knowing they would make the report undeniable. Once satisfied, he mailed it from a neighboring town, ensuring no one could trace it back to him. As he dropped the letter into the mailbox, a strange mix of relief and anxiety filled him. He had done the right thing, but the town would notice the investigation soon enough, and he could not predict how people would react. That afternoon, Ethan returned to his usual routine, feeding the livestock and repairing fences, but the peace he normally found in the rhythm of work was gone. Every sound, the clatter of a hammer, the lowing of a cow, the rustle of leaves, reminded him that the town's quiet life might soon be disrupted. He worried not only about the immediate consequences, but also about the way people might respond. In a community where everyone knew everyone, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Someone might see, someone might suspect, and that possibility lingered over him like a shadow. By evening, the first signs of change appeared. At the general store, Ethan noticed a few neighbors glancing at him more than usual. Their eyes followed him as he walked down the aisles, whispering softly to one another. Though no one spoke to him directly, the subtle shift was unmistakable. He felt the weight of curiosity pressing down, a reminder that even the most careful actions could ripple far beyond the ranch. At home, Ethan sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The warm glow painted the fields in gold and orange, but his mind was restless. He thought about the river, about the animals, and about the town that seemed so peaceful yet so easily stirred. The anonymity of his report protected him, but it did not shield him from worry. He wondered who would be blamed, who would speculate, and how the investigation might affect neighbors who had nothing to do with the dumping. The responsibility of knowing, even in silence, weighed heavily on him. The next morning brought news faster than Ethan expected. The local environmental agency had begun an investigation, sending inspectors to examine the river and the surrounding land. Word traveled quickly through the small town, and soon the whispers began. "Who could have reported it?" people asked. "Which neighbor is stirring trouble?" Though no names were mentioned, suspicion floated in the air like dust, touching every conversation and glance. Ethan noticed the subtle changes in behavior immediately. Friends he had known for years greeted him politely, but kept their distance. Conversations that once flowed easily now paused when he entered the room. Even casual gestures of friendliness were tinged with hesitation. The quiet life he had valued so deeply was suddenly complicated by an invisible tension that had nothing to do with him personally, but everything to do with the town's reaction to his choice. Despite the anxiety, Ethan remained determined. He continued his daily work, tending to the cattle and maintaining the fences, reminding himself that the land depended on his focus and care. He moved with deliberate attention, making sure every animal was fed, every gate was secure, and every structure was intact. The routine work offered some comfort, but he could not fully escape the shadow of the town's speculation. He noticed the subtle glances, the small pauses in conversation, and the hushed voices that carried just far enough to be heard. The landowner responsible for the dumping seemed aware that trouble was brewing. Ethan noticed changes in behavior during his infrequent encounters in town. The man was defensive, often speaking sharply to neighbors and casting suspicious looks in Ethan's direction. The town, small and close-knit, began to feel like a web where every action was connected and every silence interpreted. Ethan understood this, yet he refused to back down. He had chosen responsibility over convenience, and he would see it through even if it made him a target of curiosity. As days passed, the tension grew. Ethan found himself reflecting on the nature of courage. He thought about his father, who had taught him to respect the land and to act with integrity, and he remembered the lessons of patience and perseverance learned from years of ranch work. Courage, he realized, was not about bold speeches or public recognition. It was about quiet decisions, made in the face of uncertainty and carried out with care. He also reflected on the town itself, on the intricate network of relationships and reputations that defined small communities. People depended on each other, but they also judged quickly and remembered for a long time. The whispers and speculation, though unfair, were part of the social landscape, and Ethan had to navigate them carefully. He knew that acting rightly might come at a personal cost, but he accepted that cost as part of the responsibility he had chosen to bear. One afternoon, a close friend, Sarah Miller, stopped by the ranch. She had always been observant, noticing small changes in behavior and attitude. "Ethan," she said gently, "I don't know what's going on, but you've been different lately." "Are you all right?" Ethan paused, considering how much to reveal. He valued honesty, but also knew that exposing the truth might complicate matters further. After a long moment, he simply nodded. "I'm all right," he said. "Just a lot on my mind." Sarah studied him for a moment, sensing that there was more beneath the surface. "Whatever it is, I trust you'll do the right thing," she said finally, offering a quiet smile before leaving. Her words, simple as they were, gave Ethan a small measure of comfort. Even in the midst of suspicion and uncertainty, there were allies who understood the importance of doing what was right. That evening, Ethan walked along the riverbank again, observing the water and the wildlife. The inspectors had already collected samples and begun their work, and the river seemed calmer, as if waiting for justice to follow. Ethan felt a mix of relief and anxiety, relief that action had been taken, anxiety that the town's curiosity would continue to press in. The choice to report had set things in motion, and there was no turning back. As night fell, the lights of the small town twinkled in the distance. Ethan returned home, exhausted but resolute. He had acted with integrity, protecting the land and animals he loved. Yet he could not deny the tension that lingered in the air, the invisible threads of gossip and suspicion that connected every neighbor. He understood that his decision, while correct, had disrupted the quiet balance of life, and he accepted that this was part of the cost of doing what was right. Sleep was fitful that night. Dreams of the river, the animals, and the town swirled together, reflecting both his fears and his determination. He awoke with the first light of dawn once again, ready to continue his work and to face whatever consequences might come. The river had been protected, but the town's reaction was only beginning. Ethan knew that life in the small community would never be entirely the same, and he was prepared to navigate the tension with patience and integrity. In the days that followed, subtle changes continued to appear. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now hesitated, unsure how to act around a man whose actions they only partially understood. Yet there were also small gestures of support. Sarah's visit, a nod from another rancher, a quiet word of encouragement from a local shopkeeper. These moments reminded Ethan that even in the midst of suspicion, there was recognition for those who chose to act rightly, even quietly and anonymously. Ethan continued to walk the fields, feed the cattle, and repair the fences. The land demanded care, and he gave it willingly. The river, once threatened by careless actions, now showed signs of recovery. The wildlife returned, the water began to clear, and the cattle drank safely once more. The tangible results of his choice reinforced the importance of standing firm, even when the social consequences were uncertain. And so, life continued on the ranch, though nothing felt entirely unchanged. Ethan Carter, a man who had lived quietly for so long, had taken a stand. and the town had begun to stir in response. The choice he made had started ripples that could not be stopped, and he accepted that the quiet life he valued would now exist alongside curiosity, speculation, and the slow unfolding of justice. He knew that courage and responsibility often carried invisible costs, and he was ready to face them, one day at a time. The days passed, and the town seemed to hum with a quiet unease. Even though no one knew exactly who had reported the illegal dumping, suspicion traveled faster than the wind through the small streets, the local store, and the handful of cafes where residents met to talk. Everyone whispered, carefully avoiding direct accusations, yet the tension was unmistakable. Ethan Carter noticed the change in subtle ways. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now kept a polite distance. Casual conversations stopped when he entered a room, and curious glances followed him in the market or at the feed store. Ethan moved through the town carefully, aware that even a small misstep could become fodder for speculation. He did not mind being private, but now privacy had a price. In the past, he had been seen as steady and reliable, a man who minded his own business. Now the air around him carried an invisible weight. Some of the townspeople seemed puzzled by his calm demeanor, wondering if he knew more than he let on. Others were quietly critical, imagining that whoever had reported the neighbor had disrupted the peace of the town for no reason. At the same time, Ethan continued his work on the ranch. The animals depended on him, and he could not allow gossip or suspicion to distract from responsibility. Each morning, he rose before dawn, checking on the livestock and inspecting the fences. He repaired loose posts, strengthened gates, and tended to the animals' needs, finding small moments of comfort in the familiar rhythm of his work. The ranch was a constant in a time when uncertainty had begun to creep into his life, offering him a sense of stability even as tension in the town mounted. One afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a fence near the edge of his property, a neighbor, Thomas Harlan, approached. Thomas was a man known for his sharp tongue and strong opinions. He stopped a few feet away, watching Ethan quietly. "Morning, Ethan," he said, his voice casual but laced with something Ethan could not quite identify. "Busy day." Ethan nodded politely, keeping his focus on the fence. "Always busy," he replied, hammering another nail into place. He did not glance up, knowing that any reaction could be misread. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, then spoke again. "You know, people talk," he said softly, as if testing Ethan's response. "Someone's stirring up trouble with the river." Ethan paused, holding the hammer lightly in his hand. He could feel the tension rise in his chest, but he remained calm. "I hope things get sorted," he said evenly, continuing his work. He did not give Thomas an opening to push further. The neighbor frowned slightly, muttered something under his breath, and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with the fence and the sound of the river flowing nearby. Evening brought more whispers. At the general store, Ethan overheard fragments of conversation. "I wonder who it could be. Someone must have seen something," a woman said quietly to her friend. Another voice replied, "It's hard to imagine it wasn't someone from town." Ethan kept his head down, pretending to study feed bags and supplies, but the words pressed in on him. The invisible eyes of the town were everywhere, and he could feel their curiosity and suspicion like a weight on his shoulders. At home, he found small comfort in the routine of his evening chores. He fed the animals, checked the water troughs, and ensured that everything on the ranch was in order. The familiar tasks helped him center himself, reminding him that the land and the animals depended on steady hands, not idle gossip. Still, he could not fully escape the feeling that life in the town had shifted. Relationships that had once been simple and predictable now carried an undercurrent of tension, and even longtime friends seemed cautious in their interactions. One morning, Sarah Miller stopped by again. She had been observant from the beginning, and she noticed the subtle changes in the town's behavior. "Ethan, I don't think everyone understands why things happened," she said gently, looking at him with concern. "People are talking, yes, but you did the right thing. That river, it was dangerous." Ethan nodded, grateful for her words, but aware that her support could not erase the unease spreading through the town. "I know," he said quietly. "It's just hard to watch people turn on each other without knowing the whole story. I didn't do it to cause trouble. I did it because it had to be done." Sarah smiled faintly. "I know, and some of us understand that. Some of us are on your side." She stayed a little longer, helping him repair a fence post and checking the water troughs. Her presence was a reminder that even in times of tension, there were allies who valued honesty and courage. Yet when she left, Ethan felt the familiar weight return, the quiet awareness that the town's curiosity and gossip could never be fully controlled. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued. Inspectors visited the river several times, testing the water and examining the land. The pollution was confirmed, and efforts to clean it began. Yet, despite the evidence, the question of who had reported it became a topic that silently divided the community. People speculated quietly in homes, at the market, and in passing on the street. No one accused Ethan openly, but he could feel the subtle shift in glances and the careful phrasing of conversations around him. Even the local children seemed to sense the change. While playing near the fields, they would pause and look toward Ethan's ranch with curiosity. It was as if the invisible tension in the town had touched everyone, from the oldest residents to the youngest. Ethan observed them from a distance, realizing that the ripples of his choice had spread further than he had imagined. The small act of reporting pollution had not only affected him and the land, but had also created waves throughout the entire community. One afternoon, as he walked the riverbank, Ethan noticed the landowner responsible for the dumping nearby, speaking to a group of neighbors. He overheard bits of conversation, warnings, rumors, and subtle insinuations. The landowner was clearly frustrated and angry, trying to rally sympathy while deflecting blame. Ethan felt a pang of anxiety, but reminded himself that the truth was on his side. The inspectors had the evidence, and justice was being served, even if the town's social balance remained unsettled. At home that evening, Ethan reflected on the events of the past weeks. The weight of the town's suspicion was heavy, yet he also felt a quiet pride. He had acted correctly, protecting the environment and his animals, even though the choice had made life more complicated. He realized that integrity often came with a cost. Doing the right thing did not always bring gratitude or applause. Sometimes it brought tension, uncertainty, and social isolation. Yet he knew that courage was measured not by approval, but by the willingness to stand firm in the face of difficulty. As he prepared for bed, Ethan thought about the future. He could not predict how long the town's whispers would continue, nor could he control the reactions of every neighbor. All he could do was act with honesty, patience, and care, trusting that time and evidence would eventually calm the storm. He felt the familiar rhythm of the ranch, the soft lowing of the cows, the rustle of the hay, the gentle flow of the river, and found solace in these constants. No matter what the town thought, the land and animals depended on him, and he would not fail them. The following morning, Ethan was awakened by the distant sound of the inspector's trucks. He walked to the river, observing the teams working diligently to clean up the pollution. The sight brought a measure of relief. The contamination was being addressed, and the evidence of wrongdoing was undeniable. Yet, as he returned to his ranch, he saw the subtle glances of neighbors watching him from across the road. Whispers continued, and he knew that the town's curiosity would not fade quickly. One evening, after a particularly long day of tending to the cattle and reinforcing fences, Ethan found himself thinking about human nature. In a small town, people were connected in ways that could bring both comfort and pressure. Curiosity and gossip were natural, but they could also create misunderstandings and strain relationships. Ethan understood that his actions, though justified, had disrupted the social balance. And yet he also understood that the right choice was never measured by popularity. It was measured by responsibility, integrity, and the courage to act. A week later, another neighbor approached him cautiously. "Ethan," the man said, lowering his voice, "I just wanted to say, we all know someone had to do something. I don't know who it was, but thank you." The simple words, quietly offered, reminded Ethan that even amidst tension, respect and gratitude could exist. Not everyone in the town doubted or judged. Some understood, even if silently. Ethan continued his work, moving through the ranch with careful attention. He repaired fences, fed the animals, and walked the fields at dawn and dusk. The land demanded care, and he provided it without hesitation. The river, once tainted, began to recover, and the animals drank safely once more. The tangible results of his choice reinforced the importance of standing firm, even when social consequences were unclear or uncomfortable. Even at night, he reflected on the balance between courage and discretion. Standing up for what was right had caused tension, but it had also created positive change. Ethan realized that moral decisions were rarely simple. They often carried invisible costs, affected relationships, and stirred quiet conflict. Yet the integrity of action, the responsibility toward the land and animals, and the courage to face uncertainty were worth every ripple that followed. And so, life on the ranch continued, intertwined with the delicate web of the town's social dynamics. Ethan Carter, who had once lived a quiet and private life, now moved through the world with a deeper understanding of responsibility, courage, and the invisible power of choices. The investigation into the river had revealed the truth, but it had also exposed the human nature of curiosity, judgment, and the subtle ways that communities respond to actions taken in the name of right and wrong. The town remained curious. Whispers lingered. Relationships shifted. Yet amidst it all, Ethan carried on. He cared for the animals, repaired the fences, tended the land, and stood firm in his conviction. The ripples of his choice had altered the rhythm of the town, and he accepted that this was the cost of integrity. Courage, he knew, was never free. The days that followed the investigation felt different for Ethan Carter. The river, once murky and dangerous, was slowly returning to its natural clarity. The inspectors had done their work, confirming the pollution and taking steps to ensure it would not happen again. Barriers were placed to prevent further dumping, and the contaminated soil was removed. Watching the water flow clean and free, Ethan felt a sense of relief he had not experienced in weeks. The land and animals he cared for were safe once more. Yet despite the river's recovery, the town remained unsettled, caught between curiosity, suspicion, and the quiet recognition that someone had done the right thing. Ethan noticed the shift in the town immediately. Neighbors who had been distant began to warm slightly, though the whispers did not stop entirely. People continued to speculate, but there was a subtle change in tone, a mixture of respect and cautious admiration. Some residents approached him privately, offering quiet thanks without needing to reveal their understanding to others. The choice he had made, though anonymous to most, was slowly becoming recognized as an act of courage and responsibility. One morning, as Ethan tended to the fields, Sarah Miller appeared again. She had been a steady presence throughout the tension, quietly offering support and understanding. "The river is looking better every day," she said, glancing at the water flowing nearby. "And I think people are starting to see the difference that action makes." Ethan nodded, grateful for her insight. "It's not easy," he admitted. "Doing the right thing often comes with challenges we don't expect." Sarah smiled gently. "It's true, but it's also why people remember the quiet, steady courage. Not everyone notices at first, but they do remember." Ethan reflected on her words as she left, feeling a sense of comfort. Even though much of the town had been cautious or judgmental, a few understood the importance of integrity and responsibility, and their support was invaluable. The landowner responsible for the dumping had faced consequences as well. The inspector's reports were clear, and the authorities took action to hold him accountable. Fines were imposed, and he was required to follow strict measures to prevent further contamination. While some residents had initially rallied to his side, claiming it was an unfortunate mistake, the evidence was undeniable. People began to recognize that the situation had required intervention, and the focus gradually shifted from speculation to the facts of the case. Ethan watched the town's reactions carefully. The social tension that had followed him did not vanish overnight, but it began to ease as the river improved and the truth became known. People began to approach him more casually, sometimes with small gestures of acknowledgement. A nod, a quiet word, a simple smile. He realized that respect often arrived quietly, without public announcements or dramatic displays, and it could coexist with lingering curiosity. At the ranch, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The cattle grazed peacefully, the fences remained secure, and the fields thrived under Ethan's attentive care. The work that had always grounded him became a source of calm, a reminder that responsibility and routine were essential anchors in a world that sometimes shifted unpredictably. He moved through his days with focus, tending to each task carefully, knowing that the land depended on his diligence. Despite the gradual easing of social tension, Ethan could not ignore the lessons he had learned from the experience. He had discovered the invisible power of choices, the way a single decision could ripple through a community, affect relationships, and test both courage and patience. The act of doing what was right, even when inconvenient or uncomfortable, carried consequences that could not be fully predicted. Yet he realized those consequences were part of the price of integrity. One afternoon, as he repaired a gate near the river, a few neighbors approached, speaking quietly. "Ethan, I just wanted to say thank you," one of them said. Another nodded in agreement. "You did the right thing." "It wasn't easy, and we understand that now." Ethan paused, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude. He had not acted for recognition or praise, but hearing acknowledgement, even quietly, was reassuring. It reminded him that courage often matters most in the actions themselves, but recognition can follow in its own time. As the days went on, more neighbors began to offer quiet signs of respect. Some came to the ranch to ask for advice on caring for their animals or tending to the land. Others simply nodded when they passed by, acknowledging his presence without words. The town was not perfect, and curiosity and gossip remained, but a deeper sense of understanding had begun to take root. Ethan realized that actions had consequences beyond what he could see, but positive change often spread slowly, like water flowing steadily through a riverbed. Ethan also reflected on the personal impact of the experience. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and subtle judgment from people he had known for years. The isolation and tension had been difficult, but he had remained steadfast. Through it all, he had learned the importance of patience, humility, and quiet perseverance. Courage, he realized, was not always loud or visible. It often required small, deliberate steps taken in the right direction, even when no one else was watching. One evening, he stood by the river, watching the water reflect the soft glow of the setting sun. The current moved steadily, carrying leaves and small twigs downstream, and Ethan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The land had been protected, the animals were safe, and the truth had been upheld. He thought about the town, about the people who had been suspicious, and about those who had quietly supported him. The experience had been challenging, but it had strengthened his understanding of responsibility and courage. As the town continued its daily life, Ethan found a renewed appreciation for the balance between community and independence. He valued the connections he had with neighbors, but he also recognized the importance of standing firm in his principles. The experience had shown him that integrity sometimes required facing discomfort and navigating uncertainty, but the results, both tangible and personal, were worth the effort. Over time, relationships began to stabilize. Some friendships that had been strained by the tension gradually healed, while others remained cautious, a reminder of how quickly perceptions could shift. Ethan accepted this, knowing that not every relationship could return to exactly what it had been. The important thing was that he had acted rightly, protected the land, and remained true to his values. In the evenings, he often walked through the fields, observing the animals as they grazed and listened to the quiet sounds of the countryside. The peace he felt was different now, not naive or untested, but grounded in the understanding that life was complex and choices carried weight. He had learned to navigate that complexity with care, patience, and courage. The rhythm of the ranch provided stability, but his experience had also deepened his awareness of human nature, community, and responsibility. Ethan reflected on the phrase that had guided him from the very beginning: "Someone might see." It had been a caution, a reminder of privacy and caution, but now it held a deeper meaning. Someone had seen, not in a negative sense, but in the sense that actions, no matter how quiet, could ripple outward, affecting lives, relationships, and communities. He realized that doing the right thing was rarely hidden, even when attempted anonymously, and that courage, responsibility, and integrity were visible in ways that could not always be measured immediately. Months passed, and the town began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. The river flowed clear and steady, the animals thrived, and the fields remained fertile and productive. The whispers and curiosity slowly faded, replaced by a quiet understanding that responsibility and action had preserved something essential for everyone. Ethan continued his work without fanfare, tending to the land with care, repairing fences, and feeding his livestock. The rhythm of ranch life returned, now carrying the lessons of courage, integrity, and community awareness. Occasionally, neighbors approached him with questions or for advice, small gestures of acknowledgement that reflected the respect earned through his actions. Sarah Miller remained a steady presence, visiting occasionally and offering quiet support and conversation. The town was not perfect, but the community had learned in its own subtle way about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when inconvenient or challenging. Ethan often sat on the porch of his home in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air smelled of earth and hay, carrying the familiar comfort of the ranch. He reflected on the journey, from the moment he discovered the pollution to the ripple effects that had reached every corner of the town. The experience had been difficult, testing his patience, courage, and understanding of human nature. Yet it had also reinforced the values he had always held: responsibility, integrity, and quiet determination. As night fell, Ethan looked at the stars, feeling a deep sense of peace. He had faced uncertainty, social tension, and the invisible pressure of the town's curiosity, and he had acted rightly. The land, the animals, and the river were safe, and the town had slowly begun to recognize the importance of his actions. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm, but Ethan's understanding of responsibility and courage had deepened in ways that would remain with him forever. In the quiet moments, he whispered the words that had guided him all along. "Someone might see, but I did what I knew was right." And in that simple statement, there was not only reflection but also satisfaction, a quiet acknowledgement that courage, integrity, and responsibility had endured, and that the choices of one person could indeed ripple through an entire community. Ethan Carter, the quiet rancher who had lived a life of steady routine and careful work, now carried with him the understanding that courage was often invisible, yet powerful. His actions had protected the land, preserved the integrity of his community, and demonstrated that responsibility and moral clarity were worth every ripple, every moment of tension, and every silent judgment. The town had been stirred, relationships had been tested, and yet life continued, strengthened by the choices of a man who had chosen to act rightly when it mattered most. And as the river flowed steadily under the moonlight, Ethan knew that the quiet life he cherished could coexist with courage, responsibility, and the knowledge that doing the right thing, even in the face of uncertainty, was always worth it.